everybody. You're welcome back to the next episode of our Founders Forum Insights series. And this morning, I'm delighted to welcome Shane Evans, CEO and founder of Scraping Hub. We've asked Shane here this morning because he unusually, nothing COVID related, has a company that runs entirely remotely. So we've asked Shane to join us this morning to share some of his insights. Shane, you're very welcome.
Thanks, Emer. It's a pleasure to be here.
We might kick off, Shane. Just tell us a little bit about what Scraping Hub's all about.
So we get data from the web for other businesses. I started this back in 2010 with a co-founder. I had a problem in my previous company where we had an agreement with a lot of retailers to use their products on our platform, but we couldn't get the data. So I needed to solve this problem. And we invented a solution at the time. One I wished I didn't need to invent, one I wished was actually available so I could get on with building my startup. So yeah, unfortunately that startup wasn't successful, but I realized we solved a useful problem. And that was when I set about creating Scraping Hub with my co-founder, Pablo Hoffman. Now, the interesting thing was Pablo was from Uruguay. And at the time in my previous company, I'd been spending most of my time in Japan. So if you can imagine, we were from the very start, very remote from each other. So I'd actually been working remotely previously for since 2007, I think.
Wow. Okay.
So I had some experience doing this, and a lot of our early hires were software developers as well. So we were able to find people with tremendous talent, but also tremendous passion and interest in the area we were also required expertise in. A lot of our source code had been released as open source. So some people around the world were really familiar with what we're doing, loved contributing to it, but they weren't all in one place. So rather than hire people with, I suppose, that we had to train, or maybe from a slightly different background, we hired people who were super passionate about what we were doing and could contribute. So in many cases, we'd worked with them already via open source or something. So it was just a natural transition.
So it was kind of driven by availability of talent in the beginning. Is that
availability of talent was a huge part of it? Yeah, availability of talent, people we already knew. I had a remote working relationship with my co-founder already, and personally as well. Like I was in Japan, I was moving back to Ireland, to Cork. It suited our personal circumstances too.
Sure. Okay. So we might talk a little bit, obviously you've been at this now for 13 years, thereabouts. So you might just chat through a little bit from a CEO's perspective. Well, what are the benefits of this kind of model of, and just so we're kind of clear on this, all the team members work remotely, is that right?
Now we have pretty much, we're remote first. We have co-working spaces, and some people who prefer to work in co-working spaces do that. Some of our sales team, especially for training and so on, they do get together in a WeWork space in Dublin. But certainly that's only something that happened later in the stage in the company. By the first couple of years, it was 100%. First 5 years at least was 100% remote.
Okay. So from a CEO's perspective, what are the benefits of that? We're
bootstrapped as well. So especially in the early days, we were very lean. So no office space was something we avoided. But the real reason why we went remote, as we already talked about, was availability and access to talent, especially people with this niche skill and this passion. When you're starting a startup, I think you really want missionaries, not mercenaries, right? So people are really on the journey for you, with you. And in our case, we were able to find those people, but there was no way we could find them all in one location.
Yeah, fair enough. Okay. And tell me the challenges. So we've all ended up in a remote working space since March. I'm actually going into the office today for the first time since the 10th of March.
Oh, wow.
It's going to be a strange experience if I can find my way there. So we've all accidentally ended up in this space, and some people are raving about it. I saw an article on LinkedIn yesterday, 80% of people don't want to go back to the office. And others are tearing their hair out and talking about, when we get back to normal and when everybody's back to the office. So what are the challenges of I guess, from a leader's perspective of running a team that's largely or 90% remote?
So there's quite a few. And obviously, you know, in our case, we hired people who wanted to work remotely. We hired people who maybe had already have experience doing that. So we weren't faced with a situation of suddenly having to transition people who maybe enjoyed coming to the office or wanted coming to office, or maybe you've got a lovely office, you know, so that presents other challenges where people aren't, you know, everybody has to make that transition together. We do see it with people coming into the company and where they don't have that remote work. So remote work experience. So we really focus on onboarding. You know, it's make sure for new hires, onboarding is super important. They need to focus on building relationships with people in the company, mentor them, check in with them. That first experience, I know you often don't have time in an early stage startup to focus on a lot, but it's really important. And that can be a challenge. It's around communication and that building the teamwork. The other thing is keeping everybody on the same page is harder. We would have, when I founded Scraping Hub, I went out to Uruguay for 3 months. So although we were remote, we did that early stage
kickoff stint,
a kickoff stint, and we have a leadership offsite every quarter. And I, even in my previous job before Scraping Hub, as a head of software development, I would still come on site once a quarter. Because I felt that, you know, you can kind of set your quarterly priorities, you can talk about the big things, and you have that, I guess, that cohesion, and then you know, you're a little bit.
You can then separate and go and do what you need to do.
Yeah. But since we haven't, if there's people operating without that, then it gets a little bit harder at the leadership level. It is harder on managers. You know, the work hours can be difficult as well. There's a tendency to let work spill over into personal time because of the flexibility. So that's something to be aware of. I think the better managers the better managers can also protect their staff from that. So have those conversations, make sure that people are spending their time on the most important things, that give them permission to not do the stuff that doesn't matter as much. Yeah, especially in a startup, right? I always feel like there's a million fires and you have to pick which ones to put out. You know, you can't solve everything. So that's just super important. Especially.
And Shane, any tips on managing that? Like that complaint about, you know, the day bleeding into kind of personal time. Any tips on how to, like, practical tips on how do you manage that personally?
Me personally, like I go to work every morning. I say goodbye to my family. I go into work. I'll see you later. I'll see you at lunchtime. And it's awesome, right? Like I was there for my daughter's first steps, and I was there for her. Like it's brilliant. But I do say goodbye, and I do go to work, and I do try and create that separation. And that works well for me. I think most people, again, you know, if you're coming into a remote work job, it's a bit different than suddenly being forced to transition. And some of the people who are struggling with it in our company might be the people who had been used to co-working space or childcare or other things that have been taken away. But if you can get those back and create that space and create a work-like environment for yourself, then that helps a lot for me mentally to separate the things.
Okay. And in terms of, because you talked about talent acquisition being kind of one of the early drivers, I guess, of why you decided to do this. What's your experience now in terms of, you know, I had this conversation with a client last week who was saying, you know, well, we need to go out and recruit for this particular role. And we were chatting about it, and he's like, but I need to wait until everyone's back in the office. And I was like, why do you need to wait until everyone's back in the office? And he's like, well, how do I recruit somebody to work remotely, and how do I onboard them remotely? So what's your experience been of going to the market for people saying, oh, and by the way, we don't have an office, so you'll be working from home?
Yeah, I think people got that, you know, even in 2010, most people understood that it was a remote job they were interviewing for. I mean, we're always really clear about this. Now, the other thing I think about interviewing is it's important to try and interview them for the job that they have, right? So, and in our case, a lot of our early hiring would have been software developers, at least at the stage company that the first year. So we would have tried to recreate the work experience as much as possible. So the biggest predictor of success for software developers was a trial that's very similar to an actual work trial that's very similar to what it looks like working with us. And that's all remote, and that's all, so the interview is remote because they are working remote. We pay attention to how they communicate. Is it clear? Can they communicate reasonably well in written English? Because that's how most of the communication happens. And then the actual job, people do in-person interviews for programmers sometimes, and they try and make them think on their feet in a way that they don't need to in the job, right? You get time to think, and you get to use your documentation and Google and everything else. So the interview can be difficult and it can be different. So we haven't had any problems interviewing remotely for those roles. And I certainly for the first 5 years, it's different maybe when you're hiring salespeople or people who need to meet other people in person as part of their job.
So how has that evolved? Because I kind of get it. I'm married to a computer programmer who works from home pre-COVID 3 days a week and is now working 5 days a week. And like that, did his interview was all done remotely because it was with the States. And so but for roles outside of that, where I guess it's less, what's the word I'm looking for? It's less the norm, or was pre-COVID less the norm for people outside of, lots of software engineers have worked from home for, it's kind of been a thing in that segment, if you like, for a long time. But outside of that, it's less usual. So what about the more traditional roles like HR and finance and sales and stuff? How have they responded to the remote working thing?
Yeah, like it's worked out okay. I mean, we haven't been super comfortable with everything. I hired a head of product, C-level role, without meeting them, and this is the first time I've done that. So, or made any hire at that level in ages without actually meeting them, and it was I mean, even I was thinking, wow, this is a little bit different. But you just very careful about interviewing. That's it, and I think it's the same thing for in-person interviews. I think, you don't want to rely too much on looking somebody in the eyes, but actually have a fairly structured interview process, where we go into quite a lot of detail and pay an awful lot of attention to some of the soft skills, and value, fit for your values, fit for your culture. And those things are super important at any stage in a company. But early on, what the hiring you make now, that will set the culture of your company for ages, maybe for good.
Do you want to talk a little bit about culture? Culture is often associated with things like, we do pizza and beers on a Friday, and we, this is how we operate when we're all together. How does culture evolve when you're all working remotely? How is that played out?
Yeah, so years ago, I would have said, a lot of people would have said that. And I joined jobs. I can remember joining jobs fairs, and people would say, well, why do we work for you? And it's, we've got a beers on Friday and ping pong table. And it would get to me, and I think, well, look, if you want beers, join their company. We want to hire adults who, want to be able to have the brilliant career, but live where they choose, not have to compromise, be able to be there for their family and still be, be a senior executive in a great startup. It depends on what's important. I mean, culture, and I think nowadays most people are coming around to that. The kind of the beer and those things are smaller. And look, we have WeWork, and we have the Republic of Work in Cork, where we use. So we have great co-working spaces, etc. And we do meetups, and we do activities to help create some of those team bonds. But in terms of the culture, I can speak a bit about Scraping Hub's culture, but actually one of the things I noticed about most remote working companies is that they have a very high trust culture, and a very open culture. And there's something about those elements that work particularly well with remote working. I think the availability of information and being open and openness means that you're less stuck, right? People can just look stuff up. They know where to find information. Things are shared with them. You're not left wondering and needing to ask people. And that's much more difficult in a remote environment. And the creating a more of a high trust environment makes people more comfortable working remotely. From the manager's perspective, they can, they have that bond, and they can trust their staff to work. They're not thinking, I need to, see them at their desks, or and for the staff, they don't feel like they're in trouble by not being visible working. They can focus on just producing great results, and that type of culture, those elements, I think are present in most of the companies you consider, certainly pre-COVID, to have been good at remote working.
And Shane, tell me, have you had any instances over the last 10 years of people where it just hasn't worked? It's just not a fit for them.
Oh yeah, like we're 200 people and we've hired a lot over the last year. So yes, that happens. We've had people in our tiny office who haven't been a good fit.
That happens too.
Yeah, you can't get it right all of the time. So look, yeah, and remote working. I don't think the stats are worse for remote working than they are for hiring the other way. I'll say that our stats haven't been anyway. But yeah, you just learn from it, right? Like, okay, we didn't get that right. We didn't see that coming. What should we change in our interview process? What should we change in our onboarding process? And iterate and learn. You know, hiring is super important. I did every interview in the company until we were at 100 people. So
Wow.
for me, it's always been a really important activity. Who you bring, and who you bring into the company is it's one of the biggest. They're really big decisions because if you hire the right people, everything's easier. And if you hire the wrong people, nothing's going to work.
Everything's very hard.
Yeah. So I would put a lot of attention to that. And I don't think you're at a disadvantage doing it remotely. At least we don't seem to be any worse at it remotely. And I think we've done quite a good job. So just learn from it. It will happen. Try and spot it. Try and put a good onboarding process in place so that you have, not only are they building relationships with the company and with people in your company, but you have, periodic check-ins so you can see, okay, where do you expect them to be in a month, in 3 months? And are they on that journey? Is everything going okay or not? The feedback's really important as well. So, not just from the people you bring in, but from from the other coworkers, etc. Like we get anonymous feedback too. So if people maybe aren't always comfortable talking about something, they can provide it anonymously. We use Office Vibe, but they send us anonymous feedback and we can have conversations with people. Okay. We get metrics about our staff now. That maybe becomes more important as you get larger. But your feedback systems, you're at smaller stage, checking in more regularly with a lot of people, you'll have a good pulse on what people are doing, but you need to be very deliberate about it. It'll happen easily, more organically in an office. Remotely, it doesn't. So you have to think, okay, I haven't talked to Emer in a month, or in 3 weeks. So let's set up some regular cadence of communication via one-on-ones or small check-ins or something, so that you have that communication with people all the time. I think the openness as well helps there too, where, if you're communicating now via Slack or something, it's in channels where a lot of people are and they can see it and see what's going on, rather than, private channels or direct one-on-ones.
Direct email or something. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
So if I can just kind of try and summarize, Shane, a couple of things I've taken from this. So one is, process around how do we measure progress, process around how we hire. Things don't happen quite as organically, so you need to put structures around it.
That's a very good way of putting it, Emer. I've certainly noticed that remote companies tend to be more process heavy, and they tend to pay down some of that process earlier than maybe companies that would be all in one place.
Yeah, and I can see how in where you've got a startup that's in an environment where everyone's in the office, a lot of that stuff will just happen organically, and you can probably grow to 15, 20 people without a lot of that process there. But it feels like that's something in a remote scenario that needs to be in place a little bit earlier. So I guess just to wrap up, Shane, a lot of companies, I know one or two of the startups on Founders Forum who are in my group have actually quit their offices. They've gone to the landlord and said we're out, and negotiated out of their leases and have given up their office space. And I guess for them, they're kind of going, okay, we've made that decision now because the feedback from the team was actually we prefer this way of working. Any advice to them now that they're on the journey? They might be at 5 or 10 people, but they're now remote. Any advice for the path forward? What's the one piece of advice you'd give them?
I would say take some of that investment you would have had in the office and put it back to other things for your staff if you can. So those who need co-working facilities, get the team together periodically, have events, do something, to compensate for that lack of an office and that lack of, what would have happened organically.
Okay. Shane, that's been super helpful. Thank you very much for your time. Delighted to hear continued success from Scraping Hub, and all the best with it.
Thanks very much, Inger.